Hello, Oystep friends. Um, my name is April Vitsko. Many of you know me. I'm the project lead for World Stage Design 2022. And in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I acknowledge that we are preparing World Stage Design to take place on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, and Métis Region 3. The organizing committee also acknowledges that we have members living and working on a variety of traditional territories from Turtle Island, known today as North America. I'd like to introduce you to Hunter Cardinal from Nehiyawin. Cardinal is a myth architect, actor, facilitator for cultural understanding and ways of knowing. We are pleased to welcome Hunter to offer his knowledge and thoughts today. Welcome, Hunter.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here. And once again, I'm so excited to be speaking with you all from all the wonderful places that you're calling in from. So what I'm going to do to get things rolling is I'm going to share my screen. So if I can get a big thumbs up from folks once they see that huge orange slide, then yeah, there we go. Thank you, Bert. I appreciate that. But tanse everyone, or hello in the Cree language. To expand off of that very generous introduction, I really appreciate that. My name is Hunter, pronouns he, him, and I'm the director of story and half of the sibling team behind Nehiyawin, which is a storytelling and education company that I started with my sister, Jacqueline. My background rather is in performance and acting. And my main passion in life is connecting people with the very large and exciting stories that they're a part of so that they can feel rooted during turbulent times, kind of like the ones that we're in right now as, a global community of communities. Right now, I'm calling in from Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta's Region 4 here in Canada. But on my dad's side, just a little bit about who I'm from. I am Sagewinawak, which means woodland Cree, from the Sucker Creek Cree First Nation up in Treaty 8 territory here in Alberta. And on my mom's side, we're actually Polish and French by way of Israel and New York. So I have a really exciting Jewish lineage that I always love diving into and learning more about. So it's really wonderful. And yeah, together, my sister and I, we run Nehiyawin, which is a social enterprise that offers sustainable, practical, and Indigenous-based solutions for the improvement of diversity and inclusion across businesses or in businesses and communities across Turtle Island or North America. And the crux of our work is how we can help all peoples who share these lands and who work here take up their roles as stewards of treaty so that they can fully realize the gifts that they hold for us as we meet the challenges of our time. Now, what I'd like to do is to start things off, start our time together in a good way. And what that means typically as Cree people or those who are Indigenous to Canada is taking an opportunity to center whatever it is we're about to do on really important values that can help enable what it is we're about to do. So for those of you who may not have participated in a smudge ceremony in person or virtually, what a smudge ceremony is and sort of the reason why we do it is we've been taught that we smudge to cleanse ourselves, to seal out the negativity that we bring with us and kind of gather throughout our day, and seal in the positivity so that we can feel really grateful and really excited to be alive and to be here. We smudge to intention set, to reflect about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and most importantly, what are those values that we wish to have guiding whatever it is we're about to do. And we also smudge to call in our ancestors and the creator to sit with us and to help whatever it is we're about to do from the other side or the spirit world. Now, there are a bunch of different ways to smudge. It's going to differ based off of your family, your culture here in Turtle Island, and also the environment with which you're smudging. So some different peoples use certain medicines. Some ask you to take off your jewelry when you are smudging to show respect, and some ask you to stand to show that respect as well. Now, what I've been taught, just once again, this is a very specific way that my family's been doing this. We've been taught that sincerity is the highest form of prayer, that your jewelry and your glasses, that they're a part of who you are, so you can leave those on when you're smudging. And that you should use whatever you have around you to connect in your own way. And that's particularly important as we're gathering online instead of in person. And the elder that we work with very often, Elder Francis Whiskey Jack, directed us for how to do this virtually. So I'm really excited to share that with you all. So what this is going to be looking like is in just a moment, I'm going to be lighting this little bit of medicine. So this is sage. And what you're going to see is a little bit of smoke billowing upwards. Now, what I really love about this is typically when I'm speaking with folks outside of Turtle Island or North America, they're like, hey, this is similar to what we do in my culture. So I'm always excited to hear about that. So if this does sound familiar, I'd love to know. So what's going to happen is that smudge, that little smoke is going to be coming up, and we're going to be bringing that clarity to different parts of ourselves that need it. So typically what I do is I'll sort of like I'm washing my hands. I'll smudge my hands. And the idea is, I want to prepare myself to do things in a good way. Then I'll take off my glasses to smudge them because I need all the clarity I can get. And then I'll bring it to different parts of myself. So for example, I'll bring it to my eyes. I'll bring that clarity and that cleansing to my ears, to my mouth, to my heart. I'll bring it over my body for overall health and well-being. And then sometimes I'll bring it over my legs, asking to be on the right path in life. But once again, there's so many different ways to do this. Really, I've seen folks bring it to just one part of themselves, or they'll bring it to every part. It really doesn't matter as long as it feels right and comfortable for you. And on that note, this isn't mandatory. I just thought it'd be wonderful if folks wanted to take part in this. So afterwards, I'm going to hold it up to the camera here. And just as if I'm on the other side, like right across from you, you can take the time to metaphorically get that smudge from the computer, as if I'm from you or right across from you, and then you can smudge as well. But this isn't mandatory. So this is no pressure if you'd like to just observe or center yourself in whatever way or pray in whatever way that you've been taught. That's wonderful as well. And then after we're done that smudge, I'll say just a few opening words in the form of an opening prayer, and then we'll dive into our session. So I'll go first just so you can see what I would do. Kind of see that smudge coming up. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Good. Wonderful. So that's what I'll do. And then I'll hold it up to the camera here. And then just as if I'm across from you, you can take the time to bring that smudge to the different parts of yourself that need it. But once again, no pressure. Wonderful. Thank you all for joining me, for those that partook or took part, and then those that observed as well. It's always important to have witnesses. So I love that. So I'm going to say just a few words to start us off, and then we'll dive into things. So I want to give thanks, Creator, for this wonderful opportunity to gather with folks from across the world, to connect, to seek understanding and to share what I've been learning and hopefully help those in their own journey of telling stories. I think that it's such a wonderful opportunity to connect and learn how to tell stories and be inspired from each other, because it's going to be the stories that we tell about who we are and where we're going, and also the spaces that we build to make people feel safe and connected. That's going to be really important as we're learning now in all of the turbulence of this past couple of years. I would also like to ask that the ancestors of those gathered here, our friends and family and loved ones, that they come sit with us today, as well as you, Creator, to help us learn in a good way with our hearts and our minds open. And I would also like to call in that spirit of Patawao, of there is room, that idea to remind ourselves of the importance for making space for one another as we're on this very important journey of being in better relationship with all those and all that which we care about most dearly. So hi, kinenaskomatan. Now, wonderful. Yay. Thank you all so much for joining me there. I always feel so much better when we start off in that way, feel real focused. So that being said, let's dive into everything. So for those new to Canada, recently we celebrated our newest statutory holiday on September 30th. So, oh my goodness, just like almost 2 weeks ago. Feels like forever ago. But yeah, it was very recently. And it was the very first one, our National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And just to provide a little bit of context, basically what we did is we joined together as all Canadians to explore what it means to remember our past, looking at the historic harms of Canada's attempts at genocide of its Indigenous people, look honestly and bravely at our present, really see the multi-generational impacts that attempt of genocide did have, and then recommit ourselves to realizing a better future where Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples can live together in a spirit of peace, friendship, and understanding. Now, this journey that we're on of trying to achieve that future is a journey without a blueprint. But what we've been taught by our elders, those that hold knowledge in our culture, and through our languages and stories, is that those are the journeys that are most important to lead with the heart, with kindness, generosity, and with an eye towards the fact that this striving towards reconciliation is a journey that is generational in nature. So with that in mind, I'd love to get started with what is above our heads on this beautiful Turtle Island, or North America. So welcome everyone to our session today that is titled Above Turtle Island, Exploring Indigenous Histories, Futures through Star Stories. So what I'm hoping to spend this time together doing is dive into what we mean when we refer to Indigenous worldviews, have some fun sharing some star stories and what they can tell us about Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and then time allowing, provide some space and an opportunity for any questions that you may have about what we've shared today. So it's my hope that these stories will come together to equip you with the stories, knowledge, and energy to pursue this journey that we're on of reconciliation, or being in better relationship with everything that's around you and beyond. And perhaps even to understand the different ways that storytelling from other cultures can inform your practice, whatever that may be. And just a couple of notes that are important to mention before we go on is what we're about to share right now is just the tip of the iceberg of what exists about Indigenous peoples and the ways that we navigate and experience our past, present, and future. My sister and I, we are Nehewak, or Cree people, And because of this, we often draw on our own culture to illustrate certain concepts. So I just wanted to put that forward just in case you hear a little bit more of a Cree bias. That's just because that's where we come from. As well, I'm going to try to create a feeling here of us sitting in a digital circle together. So please help me by asking questions that pop into your head as they come to you in the chat. And we can handle those at the end of our time together. And lastly, I want to introduce our policy for good group relations. So this is our tatawao policy, which is a Cree word that is often used to say welcome. But what this word really means is there is room. And that's what I want everyone to feel here today, is the feeling that there's room for what you know and also what you don't know about Indigenous culture here in Turtle Island. And as well, it's something that I can't do alone. So I'll need your help to make space for everyone here. So that's our Tatawao policy, and we find it's really helpful. So that being said, let's begin by diving into Indigenous worldviews to better understand what they are and why they matter. So a worldview, that comes from the German word, and once again, for those who speak German on this call, I'm going to butcher it, but this is my attempt to honor the language. It's Weltanschauung, which encapsulates the way that one perceives, thinks about, knows, and does absolutely everything. And the reason that we're starting here is because we often forget that there are gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous worldviews. So when we try to have conversations about almost anything, we struggle to communicate. You know, we're often using the same words, but we're relating to those things differently because of our worldviews. So I'm going to back all the way up to where Indigenous worldviews come from, which is the land. So Indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island have resided here as far back as we can remember. You can ask any knowledge keeper or elder here, and they'll tell you that same thing. In fact, that word indigenous, it comes from the Latin word indigena, meaning sprung from the land. So there's a really profound connection that we have to this place. We can see ourselves an extension of the land, and therefore literally the land ourselves. So that connection to land is foundational to understanding the worldviews of Indigenous people. It's not just because we require that land to live, but it's because the land teaches us how to live. And as Nehewak or Cree people here, we have these sacred laws or ideas that are very important for us to live a good life. And we derive those sacred laws from the natural laws or how the world works around us. So to illustrate this point a little bit further, Sagiatuk is our first sacred teaching as Nehewak, which means to love one another. And this idea of Sagiatuk, it comes directly from our understanding of how the earth shows its love by allowing things to sprout or grow. But I'll dive deeper into that teaching in just a moment. But this is just to illustrate, you know, once again, the power of worldviews in terms of where they come from and how they can influence how we move through and live our lives. So because of this connection to land, this centrality of land in our belief systems as Indigenous peoples, it makes sense that things like Indigenous languages, that they have deep roots in the lands that it comes from. In fact, elders often say that speaking a language indigenous to the place that you are in is taking part in singing the song of the world. So this is why Indigenous languages, they are so diverse here on Turtle Island. They spring from the land and are thus, and are just as Indigenous peoples do, and are thus as varied as the geography and rhythms of the land that it comes from. So sometimes they can be extremely different from one another, such as the Coast Salish languages to that of my people, the Nehewak, but also they can be quite similar as well if they are in the same language family. As well, it's a myth that Indigenous languages don't have written forms. Many do. For example, the Nehiyawewin syllabics or writing system. So this is the Cree language or Nihiwewan syllabic system. That's also known as a star chart. So what you're looking at are 48 symbols. Each symbol represents a sound as well as a teaching. And to learn this language and to learn this writing system, you write it on the ground with the top symbols, basically beginning with this symbol here, and that makes the sound ah. So ah is the first sound within the Cree language, but it's also representing a teaching that we talked about earlier, that teaching of Sagiatuk. So as we mentioned, this is the Nehiyaw first sacred teaching of to love one another. So when I first learned this teaching from the knowledge keeper, Reuben Quinn, he asked us, really to make sure that we understood this language from a Cree perspective rather than an English non-Indigenous worldview. He asked us, what is the root word of Sagiatuk, to make sure that we were kind of making space for there to be another way that this language came to be. So I thought about it and I was like, oh, is the root word love? It would make sense because that's kind of the verb in this concept. And he smiled and he said that the root word actually comes from this word sagik, which doesn't translate into love in the Cree language, but rather what it means is to sprout or to grow. And this word, this idea took on a whole new meaning. The first sacred law is not just to love one another, but to grow with one another. And in that moment, my sister and I, we saw what our ancestors saw, the earth showing her love for us by allowing things to sprout or grow, and all the messiness of change, the non-linearity of this process. But it's something that is very important for us to be mindful of to help us live a good life and to be in balance. So once again, you can see a really powerful connection to the land that comes from our worldviews that's embedded in the language itself, and that helps shape, how we move through the world and articulate our sounds and our ideas as well. So because we as Indigenous peoples understand all things and beings as connected directly to the land in many ways that we are the land, then we can understand ourselves as human beings as connected to each other, with this idea that the earth is our mother and we therefore are siblings. So this belief influenced the creation of complex and varied governance models, or ways in which communities made decisions and interacted with one another. And at the core of them was a very strong spiritual element, with the idea that, we right now are not just connected to the physical world that we can see, but to the spirit world as well. And a really powerful but simple tool that emerged from these governance processes is that of the circle that would be used to help facilitate those governance processes. And the best way that this concept was put to me that really stuck was if we were to gather around in perhaps a circle of people around this tree, with the purpose of really trying to understand what this tree looks like. So it would make sense that each of us in that circle of people would see the tree in a slightly different way. So some viewpoints would be very similar because they are physically situated close to each other from their distinct positions in the circle, while others might be very different. But these different viewpoints, if you're on opposite sides of the circle, they are not in competition, but rather these viewpoints, because we are gathered around the same idea or concept or physical object, they are in relationship to one another. And what they do is they produce a greater understanding of the tree in the center of the circle if we make space for those other perspectives. And if everyone does this by listening, sharing honestly what they see, and trusting one another, what we do is we create the opportunity to build multi-dimensional understanding of whatever it is we are gathered around. So once again, this could not just be with the tree, but it could be with perhaps the concept of storytelling. And everyone on this call right now we will all have different perspectives of what that is based off of our unique worldviews and life experiences that we are bringing into that larger metaphoric circle that we're in. So we can see that differences of perspectives, as well as their necessity to help with enabling good governance within communities, can also be extended to how larger communities interacted with other communities as well. So this is where we get into an exciting part of our discussion. So to facilitate peace between cultures, many different processes of treaty making developed over time. So here we're talking about specifically Indigenous concepts of treaty making, not Western or European concepts of treaty making, which can be broken down in the following way. So Western treaties are typically written, static legal agreements that are typically made after a conflict occurs, where there's a clear winner and a clear loser. A wonderful example would be that of the Treaty of Versailles that happened after World War I. And when we're talking about Indigenous treaties, they're actually very different. So these are dynamic processes that are rooted in this idea of building kinship relationships. So how we understand ourselves as distinct peoples, as being connected to each other or related through the sharing or pursuit of certain values or ideas. And these are, once again, living processes that change over time, but are guided by those certain values. And they require a renewal aspect as well to make sure that these ideas or these agreements, they're always kind of guiding or governing two different peoples. So an example of this would be the dish with one spoon wampum belt, which was made between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee here in Turtle Island in 1142 CE. So a really long time ago. And that word wampum, it comes from the Narragansett people in the United States that is translated to mean a string of white shells. So these wampum shells would come in white, which would hold certain values of peace, of friendship, of unity, of all good things in life. And then they would also come in a darker purple as well, which would be used to create images that would hold ideas or really important concepts or stories. So this agreement took place in the area of Toronto that we know, as well as the Great Lakes region. And at the time that this treaty was made, this region was starting to get crowded. There was a lot of strain on resources, and as we know, scarcity breeds conflict. So these two nations, to avoid conflict, they came together and had a discussion in a circle about what they needed to make peace and then keep it for the long term. And what they did was they started out with seeking those shared guiding values, and then they wove a story and a wampum belt to help symbolize the story and the relationship that they were dynamically pursuing. And what they came up with was this right here. So this is the dish with one spoon wampum belt. And the idea here in that image of the dish with one spoon that you can see in the center of this belt, that dish is thought to contain all the people, the lands, and the resources in question. And the spoon is the conduct that we have towards whatever it is that's in that dish. So they're getting at, the conduct of sharing through only having one spoon, as well as doing no harm, which is why they were intentional about the use of the spoon as that utensil. So with this image, they're getting at this idea of we need to be mindful to take only what we need from this place, to be aware that we are a part of a larger ecosystem. So we need to leave something behind and nurture that larger ecosystem, because we as peoples, we don't see ourselves as separate from nature. We don't see ourselves as the center within that circle of life, but rather a part of it. So we need to be always leaving something behind to nurture it and leaving this place in a clean, healthy way. And to remind themselves of this story that they were talking about and the ideas that they're pursuing within this belt, They gathered very often to renew it, to remind themselves of the story and what they were pursuing. And it worked very well because we're still talking about it here on Turtle Island today, some 800 years later. So it really proves the efficacy or the efficiency of this system. So it makes sense that effective governance processes and good relations allowed for an incredibly active Turtle Island. You know, why would you want to stay in one place if you have family and friends everywhere? And this is why stories and artifacts of Indigenous peoples traveling long distances and engaging with different cultures are super common here. And not only that, we can find linguistic similarities between peoples here as well. So there are a lot of Blackfoot words and other Indigenous peoples here in Alberta in Canada within the Cree language and vice versa. And that can only happen linguistically speaking through long periods of peaceful coexistence, as well as tools that help nurture and manage that relationship, you know, air grievances, as well as celebrate that relationship that they do have. As well, we know that travel to Turtle Island or North America was happening well before 1492. Great example would be Leif Erikson, a Norse explorer, arrived here in 999 AD off the east coast of Canada, as well as the Basque peoples from Spain have genetic and linguistic markers that suggest that they traveled to Turtle Island or North America during the last ice age. So 10,000 years ago. So really this North America, this place that I'm calling in from, has always been a very old and vibrant gathering place. So this brings us up to the time when European explorers arrived and began the colonizing of the Americas. But instead of following that thread of the story, which everyone should absolutely understand, we'll use what I've covered so far as a good frame of reference for us to begin our exploration of Indigenous astronomy and star stories. And it's worth pausing here just to ask that obvious question, you know, before we continue on of our knowledge sharing this morning about how Indigenous peoples have woven stories into the stars, to ask the question, you know, why in the heck are we talking about Indigenous astronomy or star stories, as we'll refer to them, on this journey of reconciliation or acting as good guests on this territory? And how does this affect our wider practice of storytelling? So it's a great question, and it's related to the notion that we discussed a little while ago about the importance of leading with our hearts in the work of reconciliation, as well as being in better relationship to all that we care about. So ultimately, when you get into the weeds of seeking out ways to work towards, you know, reconciliation, which takes the form of moving towards answering the many calls to action that are contained within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report here on Canada, basically a report that helps the government of Canada be in better relationship with Indigenous peoples. We realize that the legacies of historic colonial violence, as well as ongoing colonial violence that Indigenous peoples contend with today, is absolutely pervasive. And the work that we need to do is enormous. And this is a tough realization to come to, or at least, you know, it was for my sister and I. But the thing is that this pervasiveness of these problems mean that there are just as many opportunities to dismantle these systems and heal the harms done as well. By learning about Indigenous topics like Indigenous astronomy and star stories, we are engaging with Indigenous languages, stories, and ways of connecting with one another and our understanding of the universe. We enrich ourselves, we create avenues of understanding, and we begin to glimpse, or rather get a glimpse, of how our knowledge and stories as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples can actually come together. And that is incredibly heartening. So just backing up though, what are star stories? So from an Indigenous perspective, star stories, or the constellations that we give life to through telling and retelling of their narratives, helps us as human beings make sense of our world and establish a sense of belonging and connection to ourselves, to one another, and all of that great mystery of life. So these narratives, often starring animals and spirits, but sometimes including humans as well, capture our histories. They teach us lessons, and they bring us in relationship as we engage in the process of giving and receiving those stories. But due to institutions like the residential school system, as well as others, it's estimated that many of the Nihiau or Cree star stories that have existed, only some 15% of them have survived today. And this is a tragedy not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all of us. Because as Wilfred Buck, a really wonderful expert in this field, writes in his book, Tipiskawi Kisik, or Night Sky Star Stories, our Indigenous star stories are important to all of us, stating that we arrive at knowledges from many different paths. And the more aware we are of other possibilities, the more sensitive we are to begin understanding and difference. And an interesting example of this is what's been happening with the 30-meter telescope, which is slated to be built on top of Mauna Kea, a peak many Indigenous Hawaiians hold sacred. Over the years, those people have blocked the telescope's construction several times. This is a contentious issue with two opposing camps. The first believes that scientific information that can be gained from this new large telescope outweighs the social and cultural costs for Indigenous peoples of that area. If built, it would be one of the biggest telescopes in the world, allowing us to see more deeply into space. And two, the camp that believes that the world's Indigenous peoples, without consent, of course, have sacrificed too much for the pursuit of science, and that any construction should be carried out with free, prior, and informed consent of all parties. It's a really tough situation that illuminates for us how the scientific communities can benefit from Indigenous knowledge by understanding the impact that their work can have on Indigenous people. And not only that, how critical it is to ensure that Indigenous people, perhaps drawn to astronomy through their own Indigenous star stories, are at the table for conversations like these ones, so that the strides that we take through our science are not just at the cost of the cultural richness that we all benefit from. But what I'd like to do in the time that we have is get into sharing just a couple of these star stories. So the first one that I'd like to share is one called Atima Achakashok, which is often translated into the dog stars, and is often known as Ursa Minor or the Little Dipper. Atim is the word for dog, and Achak is the word for star or spirit, which I find is a cool synonym. But this story starts a very long time ago, in our distant past, when our ancestors were struggling to live. They were constantly hungry. They were constantly alone and vulnerable to other animals, to other beings. And they were really struggling to thrive. And what's said is that the wolves saw this. They saw human beings and were concerned about how this would affect the balance of the world around them. They were very concerned about that, because if human beings were gone, once again, that going back to that idea of the circle, it would disrupt things and it would be a tragedy for everyone. So to really address what could be done, they had a council. They gathered in a circle, and they thought about what they needed to do to address this. And at this council, they invited their relatives, the coyote and the fox. And what they came up with in terms of a solution was to gift them something very important, to make an investment or a very important gift to humans to help them. And what they did was the wolves and the coyotes and the foxes, they gifted them their pups. And they sent these little puppies all into all four directions of the world to be basically the companions and relatives of humans. And what happened was that they all flourished. These new pups and people, they came together and they started living and thriving together. And to honor their sacrifice, the creator placed a reminder in the skies, in the forms of that constellation that we're talking about. And when you actually look up at the sky, depending where you are in the world, I guess, you can see this story, and it's really cool because once again, that star right there, at the very end of that ladle of the Little Dipper, is the North Star. So it doesn't actually move. And to kind of illustrate that, that's why it's called the Wolf Star. So it's that main wolf that's keeping watch over everyone. It doesn't move in the sky. But then you have, of course, the fox and the coyote afterwards, and the pups that they sent to the four directions of the world. And when you look up at the night sky, that's why this constellation, the wolves don't move, but the rest of the animals do in a circle. And what that is that ongoing process of our relatives still keeping watch over us today. So it's a really beautiful story and a cool way of relating to the stars. Another one is Mista Musqua. So this is a very old story. It's actually thought to be around 10,000 years old and is said to take place in the last ice age. So this is for that constellation that we know as well, called the Big Dipper or Ursa Major. And basically this story, it takes place a long, long time ago when there was this massive bear called Mista Musqua, or Big Bear, that roamed Turtle Island or North America. And it just left this incredible destruction in its wake. Entire villages would be destroyed along with the world around it. Rivers would have their courses changed and trees would be uprooted. And this destruction, it went on and on and on until one day all the animals agreed that it couldn't go on like this, that something needed to change. They could not live in fear anymore. So one day, what they did was they gathered in a large council with all different types of animals to figure out what could be done with this bear. And they talked and they talked and they talked until it was decided that they needed to act in order to stop this destruction. So the best trackers and hunters were chosen to essentially chase Mista Musqua away, to leave this territory. And the best hunters and trappers happened to be 7 small birds. So what they did was they went off to track this bear. And basically what they did was they flew directly into the heart of this destruction that was being caused by Mista Musqua. And in rage, Mista Musqua turned around and saw these birds coming at them. And what he did was it tried to scare off those birds by standing up and roaring. But the birds didn't flee. And that actually really unsettled Mista Musqua. And it caused a lot of fear for that big bear. So what it did was it turned and it ran in the opposite direction. And basically the chase was on at that point. And the birds flew after Mista Musqua. And this chase went on for days and days until one day, Mista Musqua decided to take his last stand to try to frighten them off one more time. And he turned and he reared up on his hind legs and towered over these birds and faced them. But in that moment, the robin, that chief bird among these 7 hunters, it dove in and pierced the chest of this great bear. And that was a really detrimental blow to Mista Musqua. and blood fell from its chest and it turned all of the broad leaves in that area red. And Miss Damasqua, then really injured, it ran away so fast that it's thought that it actually, he left this world because of how fast he was going and flew into the stars. So to honor this, the bravery of those small birds and to remind people the harms that come from using one's strength in a violent and disrespectful way, the creator placed this story into the sky. And that's why it's known as Miss Damasqua. And we also know it as well as Ursa Major or the Big Dipper. So it's a really, really cool story that I love thinking about. And once again, it's an old, old, old story. It's a living memory of the Ice Age. And it's thought to center around what we know as the short-faced cave bear, which was a giant bear that actually did roam North America for a long time. So now that our time together is rapidly coming to a close, that went fast, I thought that it would make sense to think about how with this new and or deepened knowledge about Indigenous worldviews, perspectives, and applications of that knowledge, you might think differently about what you can do here while working towards reconciliation, engaging with Indigenous peoples when you're doing your work, and beyond that. So what I would like to do is challenge you to think about how you might contribute to this journey if you happen to be here, or maybe with the Indigenous peoples wherever you are in your world, by leveraging a framework that my sister and I found very effective in our work in community. It's a very simple feedback loop, but we find that it's just a really great sort of map to put this knowledge into action. So the first step on this is listen and learn. So educate yourself with the wide variety of materials that can be available online in books and in conversation with peoples in your circles about Indigenous things, wherever you are, once again. Next, it would be to take action. So develop an initiative of sorts. Maybe it's a project that you're working on, ideally concerning a topic close to your heart that inspires you and brings that interest. And perhaps articulate a goal. Make it very clear what you're hoping to achieve. And then you get bonus points as well if you bring your friends along. The next is sharing your learning. So basically, this is answering the question of how did it go, good or bad? Share back with those in your circles, not just so that that information gets out there about what works and what doesn't work, but so that we can instill a new culture of learning in public at this time of trying to be in better relationship with Indigenous peoples and ideas. And after that, you can just repeat that three-step process. So we think that that's going to be really useful for you all to think about when engaging with Indigenous knowledges and worldviews, as well as peoples. And once again, this could be applied wherever you go. And I think it's going to be pretty helpful because what this does is it can help unlock really valuable tool sets that can help us deepen and enrich the work that we do in our own fields. So yeah, and then another thing to help spark new ideas, especially, if you're here in Canada and you're trying to think about how you can sustainably work towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, is kind of remember that teaching of Sagiatuk that I mentioned before. And really thinking about that can help us remember, if we're starting from something small and growing into something larger, how are we thinking about scale and time? We're so often used to falling into the trap of thinking that only big actions matter. But really, it will be small actions of all of us over generations that will help us truly move forward together. So try and think about what you could do in a day or in a week, or maybe even in a month. So that's a really helpful framework that I think you all can take away and start thinking about while you're doing your own work. But that being said, with the time remaining, I'd like to hear, if there are any questions that you have. We have a really special group of folks, so I'm curious as well if some of this stuff resonates with you from wherever you're calling. or even, your own cultures as well. I always love finding those connections. So yeah, now's our time. If you'd like, you can type your question into the chat, or if you're feeling brave, you can unmute yourself, and we can have sort of that discussion. So once again, I'll leave some space. And if there's a moment of silence, that's totally fine. Sometimes it takes me a while to percolate a question, but you can either use the raised hand function or you can just unmute yourself. Actually, I'll stop sharing my screen so we can see each other just a little bit better.
Thank you very much, Hunter. As always, I feel like when I'm in sessions with you, I take away so much learning and just I always feel more open to the possibilities, which I always really appreciate. So thank you for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. That's so kind. Any other compliments as well? I'm open to that too. I'm just kidding. Oh,
Maybe
yeah. Yeah, Roseanne. Yeah, I see you unmuted. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm very emotional now because it's so simple and so difficult to achieve this acknowledgement. And it seems we are always trying to go to somewhere and we lost ourselves in the middle of the way, always thinking how to achieve something big, but it's like you say, it's the small things, each step, and how it's difficult and how it's so simple to look at the stars, to look back to these stories. And thank you very much.
My pleasure, Roseanne. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I think that it's really simple, but it's often overlooked, because it's kind of a tragic story that we don't think that we are enough as people, that our actions don't matter, but it's not true. They really do. And, if we can remember those larger stories, of course, those small steps add up over time. Of course, each one is significant, and therefore we all are. So I totally feel the same way, but thank you so much for sharing.
And Bassam has a hand raised.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
My question is very nice storytelling, yes, but I wonder if there's a playwriters or books that already written about that in your society, in your culture, and related to theater. If that exists, can we have resources about that? Because the storytelling of yours itself, it can weave to a lot of theater plays. Thank you.
I'm right there with you, Bassam. Like, we actually, so yes, there is a larger growing source of these stories. Once again, a lot of them have been lost, but we still have some, which is great. And I'll share that with April and Lisa so that you all can read it. It's a really cool growing area of study. But just to like tie on your point too, what I'm personally excited about is, there's a whole canon of stories that have yet to be created that can use the architecture of Indigenous myths that are really old, to tell new stories as well. So what's cool, there's this teaching where all the stories that we know, that we've woven into the stars, exist in a sea of other stories that have yet to be created, and told for our time today. So with Indigenous cultures, as much as it is about preserving ideas in these stories, it's also about generating new ones as well. And with that, you can start completely from scratch, or you can use the other stories and tools that we have existing to kind of provide that mythic architecture to tell new stories. So I get really excited about that, but I'm right there with you. I think it could be really cool just to see how many different peoples from outside Turtle Island will engage with these stories and use it to kind of further their own stories of what they need to tell wherever they are as well. So I'll send you all that the book, and yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we have another raised
Yes.
hand. Yeah, sorry, Lisa. Yeah.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Abby.
Hi, thank you very much. It's a brilliant presentation, brilliant story. Your voice is magical as well. Just drive us into this story. This, yeah, we must tell that because it's about sonority as well. You know, the sound is very important, the rhythm and everything. And I was very touched about 2 points you brought up, and one is the theme of this conference, that reconnecting, and the other one is vulnerability. And this is about a quick true story. And I think we can, sometimes we just need to do that as part of our exercise, or time, give a time for ourselves to truly reconnect and understand vulnerability. I was 2.5 years ago, I was working in Suriname, the ex-Dutch colony in the north of South America. And we were doing research for an exhibition. So we were in contact with the Vinti. The Vinti are the people who works healing using the nature force and all of that. So it's beautiful to see. It was beautiful to see the alphabet as well. It's very similar to the Maroons alphabet. I can't remember the name now, but it might come to my mind. But I remember we went to a journey to do this research, and we spent like a 10 hours travel in a boat to go to a coastal area where the giant turtles were giving birth, were just dropping eggs. And we stay another 5 hours just waiting for that happen in the darkness, watching the stars. And the turtles, they go in such a trance when they start dropping the eggs. They can't notice the presence around that. So they go so vulnerable. They became so vulnerable. You could do whatever to them. And then sometimes I think that's the thing we need to understand for reconnecting to their level with the nature. We need to bend the nature. We need to step back and have this maybe travel so far away from ourselves. That helps us to reconnect. And since then, I found myself very reconnected with some rituals and kind of, we started doing the sage thing and all the rituals that I used to do much long ago. But I went so far away, and through a project as a designer, I was dragged into a completely different country, different culture, and I reconnected with lots of things, and inclusive with myself, and watching the vulnerability, how you can be powerful to preserve or to destroy something and get in their consciousness. So as a designer, I have that very, very clear today. If I travel, if I tour with something to another country, I'm very conscious about what do I bring to another country? What do I leave behind me? Mm. So I think that's something we should learn and practice.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Abby. That's so wonderful. Yeah, that's powerful story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And as well, too, I know that we're 1 minute over, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I'm sure you have, this is either the beginning or ending a long series of Zoom calls. So I'll pass it back to those that gathered us here, April and Lisa, if you have any closing remarks. The floor is yours.
I just want to express my thanks, Hunter, for your sharing of your knowledge and your stories, and to let everyone know we're continuing to engage with Hunter as our process goes along. So you hopefully will see him at World Stage Design in Calgary in 2022, and yeah, there will be lots of programming on Indigenous ways of knowing and performance that is created by Indigenous artists. So that is also another way to engage in beginning to understand cultures and seeing how stories are told from a variety of places in Turtle Island. So thank you once again, Hunter. As always, it's a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, morning, evening. Yeah, it was wonderful.
And we'll share the resources. We also have a list from our previous session with Hunter that we can share. So it'll go out by email in an Oistat newsletter. We'll make sure we get it out.
Wonderful.
I'd also like to say, in terms of World Stage Design events, there will also be an event on March 27th on World Theatre Day. And we haven't set the programming for that yet, but we encourage you to attend those events.